Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the May 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Address of the Central Committee to the Communist League by Marx and Engels from 1850. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this document is the source of a couple of notable things from Marxist history. The first is the phrase, the permanent revolution. This was picked up by Trotsky later on and became a sort of major pillar of Trotskyism, particularly in the context of the power struggle with Stalin in the early years of the USSR regarding the socialism in one country versus permanent revolution, which I think is something of a false dichotomy, but that's for another time. Anyway, the other notable thing is the "under no pretext" quote, which is frequently cited to describe Marxist thoughts on gun control. Given all of the discussion in the United States right now about how there have been 220 some mass shootings in this year alone, and there have only been about 150 days in the year, I thought that it might be a good time to do this document as an audiobook and look at that quote in its original context. Now, as regards context, first of all, what was the Communist League? So this was arguably the first Marxist political party. It only lasted about 5 years, from the late 1840s to the early 1850s, but that was an incredibly eventful, tumultuous time in European history. Although there had been earlier revolutions against feudalism by the emerging capitalist class, these were not workers' revolutions, they were capitalist revolutions. This particular wave of them in 1848 was really pronounced, and it was a defining point in terms of establishing new capitalist nation states and consolidating capitalist power against the outgoing feudal ruling classes. Now, I said that these weren't primarily workers' revolutions. In other words, they weren't primarily revolutions by the proletariat and allied classes against the capitalist class. However, the working classes, proletariat, semi-proletariat, peasantry, etc., played a role in them. They just weren't strong enough at that time to take the lead role. You can even see that in the French bourgeois revolution in 1789. The proletariat played a role. However, it was tiny because capitalism was not as fully established, and it had not yet proletarianized society. It had not created a large proletariat yet. Moving forward to the 1840s, the proletariat was a more significant presence within that more advanced, although still early, capitalist society. Noting that, and knowing that the proletariat was the future of capitalism, in fact, destined to overthrow capitalism and move on into socialism, Marx, Engels, and other communists at that time, in the 1840s here in 1850, were advocating and angling for the proletariat to play the biggest role that they possibly could, and even outpace the capitalists if that were to be possible. And if it's not possible, at least to protect themselves against the capitalists during this revolutionary time. So a lot of this document is about that. Without further ado, let's get into it. So this is from London, March 1850, transcribed by Gearhart at ccsn.edu, proofed and corrected by Alec Blaine, 2006. Thanks as usual to Marxists.org for hosting this file and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So let's begin. Brothers, in the two revolutionary years of 1848 and 49, the League proved itself in two ways. First, its members everywhere involved themselves energetically in the movement and stood in the front ranks of the only decisively revolutionary class, the proletariat, in the press, on the barricades, and on the battlefields. The League further proved itself in that its understanding of the movement, as expressed in the circulars issued by the Congresses and the Central Committee of 1847 and in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, has been shown to be the only correct one, and the expectations expressed in these documents have been completely fulfilled. This, previously only propagated by the League in secret, is now on everyone's lips and is preached openly in the marketplace. At the same time, however, the formerly strong organization of the League has been considerably weakened. A large number of members who were directly involved in the movement thought that the time for secret societies was over and that public action alone was sufficient. The individual districts and communes allowed their connections with the Central Committee to weaken and gradually become dormant. So, while the Democratic Party, the party of the petty bourgeoisie, has become more and more organized in Germany, the Workers' Party has lost its only firm foothold, remaining organized at best in individual localities for local purposes. Within the general movement, it has consequently come under the complete domination and leadership of the petty bourgeois Democrats. Hey, was this written in 1850 or 2022? This situation cannot be allowed to continue. The independence of the workers must be restored. The Central Committee recognized this necessity, and it therefore sent an emissary, Joseph Moll, to Germany in the winter of 1848-9 to reorganize the League. Moll's mission, however, failed to produce any lasting effect, partly because the German workers at that time had not enough experience and partly because it was interrupted by the insurrection last May. Moll himself took up arms, joined the Baden-Palatinate army, and fell on 29 June in the Battle of the River Merg. The League lost in him one of the oldest, most active, and most reliable members, who had been involved in all the congresses and central committees and had earlier conducted a series of missions with great success. Since the defeat of the German and French revolutionary parties in July 1849, almost all the members of the Central Committee have reassembled in London. They have replenished their numbers with new revolutionary forces and set about reorganizing the League with renewed zeal. This reorganization can only be achieved by an emissary, and the Central Committee considers it most important to dispatch the emissary at this very moment, when a new revolution is imminent. That is, when the Workers' Party must go into battle with the maximum degree of organization, unity, and independence, so that it is not exploited and taken in tow by the bourgeoisie, as in 1848. We told you already in 1848, brothers, that the German liberal bourgeoisie would soon come to power and would immediately turn its newly won power against the workers. You have seen how this forecast came true. It was indeed the bourgeoisie which took possession of the state authority in the wake of the March movement of 1848 and used this power to drive the workers, its allies in the struggle, back into their former oppressed position. Although the bourgeoisie could accomplish this only by entering into an alliance with the feudal party, which had been defeated in March and eventually even had to surrender power once more to this feudal absolutist party, is nevertheless secured favorable conditions for itself. Comment: the bourgeoisie has done this so many times in one form or another, different points in history. World War II is a great example. Certain imperialists, allying temporarily with socialists in order to defeat the fascist imperialist upstarts, Germany, Japan, Italy, etc. And then as soon as that war was won and those imperialist upstarts subdued, what did those imperialists do? Red Scare, Cold War, McCarthyism, so on and so forth. In fact, allying with the former fascists that they had just defeated in order to prosecute that suppression of organized labor and socialism. You see this today on a smaller historical timeline with the Democrats constantly blaming the left for their losses, yet as soon as the Democrats do achieve power, they continue to enable the existence of the far right and, in fact, turn on the left, because that is what it's all about. It's about preserving the primacy of bourgeois rule, even if it means allying with, well, today neo-feudalists, or back in 1850, old-school feudalists. Continuing. In view of the government's financial difficulties, these conditions would ensure that power would, in the long run, fall into its hands again, and that all its interests would be secured if it were possible for the revolutionary movement to assume from now on a so-called peaceful course of development. In order to guarantee its power, the bourgeoisie would not even need to arouse hatred by taking violent measures against the people, as all of these violent measures have already been carried out by the feudal counter-revolution. Comment on the feudal counter-revolution. So this was maybe the biggest wave of revolutions that Europe has ever seen in 1848. However, soon afterward, there was sweeping counter-revolution, driving a lot of this progress backward. Still, the events of these years would be remembered for a long time, and they would have some lasting impacts. Continuing. But events will not take this peaceful course. On the contrary, the revolution, which will accelerate the course of events, is imminent, whether it is initiated by an independent rising of the French proletariat or by an invasion of the revolutionary Babel by the Holy Alliance. The treacherous role that the German liberal bourgeoisie played against the people in 1848 will be assumed in the coming revolution by the democratic petty bourgeoisie, which now occupies the same position in the opposition as the liberal bourgeoisie did before 1848. This Democratic Party, which is far more dangerous for the workers than were the liberals earlier, is composed of three elements. One, the most progressive elements of the big bourgeoisie, who pursue the goal of the immediate and complete overthrow of feudalism and absolutism. This fraction is represented by the former Berlin Vereinbarer, the tax resistors. Two, the constitutional democratic petty bourgeois, whose main aim during the previous movement was the formation of a more or less democratic federal state. This is what their representative, the left, in the Frankfurt Assembly and later the Stuttgart Parliament worked for, as they themselves did in the Reich Constitution campaign. Three, the Republican petty bourgeois, whose ideal is a German federal republic similar to that in Switzerland, and who now call themselves Red and Social Democratic because they cherish the pious wish to abolish the pressure exerted by big capital on small capital, by the big bourgeoisie on the petty bourgeoisie. The representatives of this fraction were the members of the Democratic Congresses and committees, the leaders of the Democratic associations, and the editors of the Democratic newspapers. After their defeat, all these fractions claimed to be Republicans or Reds, just as at the present time members of the Republican petty bourgeoisie in France call themselves socialists, where, as in Württemberg, Bavaria, etc., they still find a chance to pursue their ends by constitutional means. They seize the opportunity to retain their old phrases and prove by their actions that they have not changed in the least. Furthermore, it goes without saying that the changed name of this party does not alter in the least its relationship to the workers, but merely proves that it is now obliged to form a front against the bourgeoisie, which has united with absolutism, and to seek the support of the proletariat. The petty bourgeois Democratic Party in Germany is very powerful. It not only embraces the great majority of the urban middle class, the small industrial merchants and master craftsmen, it also includes among its followers the peasants and rural proletariat, insofar as the latter has not yet found support among the independent proletariat of the towns. The relationship of the Revolutionary Workers' Party to the petty bourgeois Democrats is this. It cooperates with them against the party which they aim to overthrow. It opposes them wherever they wish to secure their own position. Let's just restate that. The relationship of the Revolutionary Workers' Party to the petty bourgeois Democrats is this. It cooperates with them against the party which they aim to overthrow, but it opposes them wherever they wish to secure their own position. So they're not really allies, and they don't want to see the petty bourgeois Democrats secure their own position, gain their own power, but it does ally with them against the big bourgeoisie. Continuing. The democratic petty bourgeois, far from wanting to transform the whole society in the interests of the revolutionary proletarians, only aspire to a change in social conditions which will make the existing society as tolerable and comfortable for themselves as possible. They therefore demand, above all else, a reduction in government spending through a restriction of the bureaucracy and the transference of the major tax burden into the large landowners and bourgeoisie. They further demand the removal of the pressure exerted by big capital on small capital through the establishment of public credit institutions and the passing of laws against usury, whereby it would be possible for themselves and the peasants to receive advances on favorable terms from the state instead of from capitalists. Also, the introduction of bourgeois property relationships on land through the complete abolition of feudalism. In order to achieve all this, they require a democratic form of government, either constitutional or republican, which would give them and their peasant allies the majority. They also require a democratic system of local government to give them direct control over municipal property and over a series of political offices which are at present in the hands of the bureaucrats. The rule of capital and its rapid accumulation is to be further counteracted, partly by a curtailment of the right of inheritance, and partly by the transference of as much employment as possible to the state. As far as the workers are concerned, one thing above all is definite. They are to remain wage laborers as before. However, the democratic petty bourgeois want better wages and security for the workers, and hope to achieve this by an extension of state employment and by welfare measures. In short, they hope to bribe the workers with a more or less disguised form of alms, and to break their revolutionary strength by temporarily rendering their situation tolerable. The demands of petty bourgeois democracy summarized here are not expressed by all sections of it at once, and in their totality they are the explicit goal of only a very few of its followers. The further particular individuals or fractions of the petty bourgeoisie advance, the more of these demands they will explicitly adopt, and the few who recognize their own program in what has been mentioned above might well believe that they have put forward the maximum that can be demanded from the revolution. But these demands can in no way satisfy the party of the proletariat. While the democratic petty bourgeois want to bring the revolution to an end as quickly as possible, achieving at most the aims already mentioned, it is our interest and our task to make the revolution permanent until all the more or less propertied classes have been driven from their ruling positions, until the proletariat has conquered state power, and until the association of the proletarians has progressed sufficiently far, not only in one country, but in all the leading countries of the world, that competition between the proletarians of these countries ceases, and at least the decisive forces of production are concentrated in the hands of the workers. Our concern cannot simply be to modify private property, but to abolish it, not to hush up class antagonisms, but to abolish classes, not to improve the existing society, but to found a new one. There is no doubt that during the further course of the revolution in Germany, the petty bourgeois democrats will, for the moment, acquire a predominant influence. The question is, therefore, what is to be the attitude of the proletariat, and in particular of the League, towards them? 1. While present conditions continue, in which the petty bourgeois democrats are also oppressed. 2. In the coming revolutionary struggle, which will put them in a dominant position. And 3. After this struggle, during the period of petty bourgeois predominance over the classes which have been overthrown and over the proletariat. Comment. So before we go ahead, there are 3 numbered sections which correspond to those 3 periods. So let's just review so that we make sure that we understand what is being said. So Marx and Engels are saying that there is no doubt that during the further course of the revolution in Germany, the petty bourgeois democrats will for the moment acquire a predominant influence. So they are predicting at least momentary dominance by the petty bourgeois democrats. So then they continue. The question is therefore, what should the proletariat and should the Communist League do? Number 1, while the petty bourgeois democrats are still fighting. 2, in the revolutionary struggle, which is when the petty bourgeois democrats will achieve power. And 3, after the struggle, for however long the petty bourgeois achieve their dominance and hold it. So basically, again, 1, before the fight, 2, during the fight, 3, after the fight, when the petty bourgeois have achieved social dominance both over the overthrown classes and over the proletariat, which hasn't been overthrown because it has not yet achieved power. Okay. 1. At the moment, while the democratic petty bourgeois are everywhere oppressed, they preach to the proletariat general unity and reconciliation. They extend the hand of friendship and seek to found a great opposition party which will embrace all shades of democratic opinion. That is, they seek to ensnare the workers in a party organization in which general, social democratic phrases prevail while their particular interests are kept hidden behind, and in which, for the sake of preserving the peace, the specific demands of the proletariat may not be presented. Such a unity would be to their advantage alone, and to the complete disadvantage of the proletariat. The proletariat would lose all its hard-won independent position, and be reduced once more to a mere appendage of official bourgeois democracy. This unity must therefore be resisted in the most decisive manner. Instead of lowering themselves to the level of an applauding chorus, the workers, and above all the League, must work for the creation of an independent organization of the Workers' Party, both open and secret, and alongside the official Democrats, and the League must aim to make every one of its communes a center and nucleus of workers' associations in which the position and interests of the proletariat can be discussed free from bourgeois influence. Comment. When I am constantly saying to people, you have to get out of the Democratic Party, even if you think it's going to make you more likely to win an election here or there. This thing about the position and the interests of the proletariat being discussed free from bourgeois influence, that is the thing, that's why you've got to get out of the Democratic Party, which is 1% controlled. It's a capitalist party. It is under bourgeois influence deeply and heavily, and you're never going to use that party as, quote, a center and nucleus of workers' associations in which the position and interests of the proletariat can be discussed free from bourgeois influence. Just wanted to comment that because I'm saying it constantly. Is why we need an independent left party. Continuing. How serious the bourgeois Democrats are about an alliance in which the proletariat has equal power and equal rights is demonstrated by the Breslau Democrats, who are conducting a furious campaign in their organ, the Neue Oder Zeitung, against independently organized workers, whom they call socialists. In the event of a struggle against a common enemy, a special alliance is unnecessary. As soon as such an enemy has to be fought directly, the interests of both parties will coincide for the moment, and an association of momentary expedience will arise spontaneously in the future, as it has in the past. It goes without saying that in the bloody conflicts to come, as in all others, it will be the workers, with their courage, resolution, and self-sacrifice, who will be chiefly responsible for achieving victory. As in the past, so in the coming struggle also, the petty bourgeoisie, to a man, will hesitate as long as possible and remain fearful, irresolute, and inactive. But when victory is certain, it will claim it for itself and will call upon the workers to behave in an orderly fashion, to return to work, and to prevent so-called excesses, and it will exclude the proletariat from the fruits of victory. It does not lie within the power of the workers to prevent the petty bourgeois Democrats from doing this, but it does lie within their power to make it as difficult as possible for the petty bourgeoisie to use its power against the armed proletariat, and to dictate such conditions to them that the rule of the bourgeois Democrats, from the very first, will carry within it the seeds of its own destruction, and its subsequent displacement by the proletariat will be made considerably easier. Above all, during and immediately after the struggle, the workers, as far as it is at all possible, must oppose bourgeois attempts at pacification and force the Democrats to carry out their terroristic phrases. They must work to ensure that the immediate revolutionary excitement is not suddenly suppressed after the victory. On the contrary, it must be sustained for as long as possible. Far from opposing the so-called excesses, instances of popular vengeance against hated individuals, or against public buildings with which hateful memories are associated, the Workers' Party must not only tolerate these actions, but must even give them direction. During and after the struggle, the workers must at every opportunity put forward their own demands against those of the bourgeois Democrats. They must demand guarantees for the workers as soon as the democratic bourgeoisie sets about taking over the government. They must achieve these guarantees by force if necessary, and generally make sure that the new rulers commit themselves to all possible concessions and promises, the surest means of compromising them. They must check in every way, and as far as is possible, the victory euphoria and enthusiasm for the new situation, which follow every successful street battle, with a cool and cold-blooded analysis of the situation, and with undisguised mistrust of the new government. Alongside the new official governments, they must simultaneously establish their own revolutionary workers' governments, either in the form of local executive committees and councils, or through workers' clubs or committees, so that the bourgeois democratic governments not only immediately lose the support of the workers, but find themselves from the very beginning supervised and threatened by authorities behind which stand the whole mass of the workers. In a word, from the very moment of victory, the workers' suspicion must be directed no longer against the defeated reactionary party, but against their former ally, against the party which intends to exploit the common victory for itself. So that's the end of point one. I just want to summarize the recommendations at the end here. So starting with during and after the struggle, the workers must at every opportunity put forward their own demands against those of the bourgeois Democrats. So basically, this is accepting that in this case, it is most likely that the bourgeois Democrats are going to take power and set up their new bourgeois government. However, Marx and Engels are insisting that alongside this, not only are you going to make as many demands as you can out of that government for the workers and achieve those guarantees, quote, by force if necessary. Then, once you've got the government sort of where the workers want it, like as far as the workers can get it, establish undisguised mistrust of that government, even though it's making those concessions. You're not like, oh, everything's great now. No, you've gotten concessions, but undisguised mistrust of it. And then, alongside that new official government, the workers must simultaneously establish their own revolutionary workers' governments, either in the form of local executive committees and councils or through workers' clubs and committees, so that workers have somewhere else to rally, not behind the new bourgeois government, but behind the revolutionary workers' councils, which are intended to be the future. So this is basically what the Soviets were. First Russian Revolution, 1905, bourgeois revolution, headed by the bourgeoisie. The workers are there, obviously organizing, but not able to take power yet. So, okay, 1905 revolution, you get some concessions out of the sort of emerging bourgeois government. The feudal czarist order wasn't entirely abolished and wouldn't be until early 1917. But in the meantime, they got some concessions out of the czarist government in 1905, some reforms, etc., and the workers' movement set up local executive committees and councils. That's what Soviet means. And then these were established as the hub of workers' revolutionary activity because, okay, great, the bourgeoisie overthrew the feudalists, fine, but this is not the end state that the proletarians are looking for. So, don't start rallying behind the bourgeoisie from that point on. Continuing the quote, in a word, from the very moment of victory, the workers' suspicion must be directed no longer against the defeated reactionary party, but against their former ally, against the party which intends to exploit the common victory for itself. So, again, in the case of Russia, clear example of this in practice, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat were both fighting against Tsarism. However, the bourgeoisie did not intend really to share power with the workers. That's not how capitalism works. Hence, the class-conscious workers who are aware that that's not how capitalism works, and no matter what the bourgeoisie promised, that's not what they were ultimately going to do. The system demands that capitalists exploit workers. That's how capitalism works. So the workers set up their own thing and then build and plot for the day that they could have their own revolution. And in fact, they did in the case of Russia in later 1917, after the bourgeoisie had helpfully cleared out the czarist government and set up the provisional government. The workers' councils, the organized workers, were able to then do the same to the bourgeoisie, and in a very short time span as well. Of course, all this was happening in the case of Russia in 1917 against the backdrop of several years of World War I. So a time of massive social upheaval and military violence to begin with that the workers were able to use to their advantage to emerge victorious and then establish a society where they were able to begin building socialism. All right, so now on to step 2, during the struggle when the bourgeoisie actually seizes power. 2, to be able forcefully and threateningly to oppose this party, whose betrayal of the workers will begin with the very first hour of their victory. The workers must be armed and organized. The whole proletariat must be armed at once with muskets, rifles, cannon, and ammunition, and the revival of the old-style citizens' militia, directed against the workers, must be opposed. Where the formation of this militia can't be prevented, the workers must try to organize themselves independently as a proletarian guard, with elected leaders and with their own elected general staff. They must try to place themselves not under the orders of the state authority, but of the revolutionary local councils set up by the workers. Where the workers are employed by the state, they must arm and organize themselves into special corps with elected leaders, or as a part of the proletarian guard. Under no pretext should arms and ammunition be surrendered. Any attempt to disarm the workers must be frustrated by force if necessary. The destruction of the bourgeois democrats' influence over the workers, and the enforcement of conditions which will compromise the rule of bourgeois democracy, which is for the moment inevitable, and make it as difficult as possible. These are the main points which the proletariat, and therefore the League, must keep in mind during and after the approaching uprising. Okay, so that's the end of point 2. So that's during and after the approaching uprising. Marx and Engels are recommending that to be able forcefully and threateningly to oppose this ascendant bourgeois party, who are going to betray the workers the minute that they take power, the workers need to be armed and organized. So, taking the revolutionary councils that have already been established at this point and using those as the authority that's going to direct this sort of proletarian guard, proletarian militia, the aim of the organized workers is going to be A, to destroy the bourgeois democrats' influence over the workers, and B, to enforce conditions which will compromise the rule of bourgeois democracy, which at that time they can't avoid it, so they just have to compromise it as much as they can. So keep in mind, this is basically during the uprising. This is point 2, this is the middle phase, literally during the bourgeois revolution. So now we go on to point 3, which again Marx describes as after this struggle during the period of petty bourgeois predominance over the classes which have been overthrown and over the proletariat. So, point 3. As soon as the new governments have established themselves, their struggle against the workers will begin. Comment why? Because in capitalism, the ruling class is the bourgeoisie, and the ruled class is the proletariat, and the other non-propertied working classes, which over time just increasingly get folded into the proletariat. But basically the feudalists, the old ruling class, is now out of the picture. The new target of the ruling capitalists is to set up their exploitation of the proletariat, which is characteristic of capitalism, as effectively as possible. Continuing, if the workers are able to forcibly oppose the democratic petty bourgeois, it is essential above all for them to be independently organized and centralized in clubs. At the soonest possible moment after the overthrow of the present governments, the Central Committee will come to Germany and will immediately convene a Congress, submitting to it the necessary proposals for the centralization of the workers' clubs under a directorate established at the movement's center of operations. So comment, Marx is basically describing what would later become the sort of system that a communist party would use. However, at this time, it was the Communist League and the Central Committee, so some of the terminology is different. But this centralization of the workers' clubs under a directorate, all that kind of stuff, this is like, as soon as this bourgeois revolution has happened, or as Marx and Engels say, at the soonest possible moment after the overthrow of the present governments, Central Committee has to come in, convene a Congress, try to centralize the workers' clubs, get the workers, quote, independently organized and centralized in clubs. Continuing. The speedy operation of at least provincial connections between the workers' clubs is one of the prime requirements for the strengthening and development of the Workers' Party. The immediate result of the overthrow of the existing governments will be the election of a national representative body, i.e. a parliament, something like that. Here, the proletariat must take care, 1. That by sharp practices, local authorities and government commissioners do not, under any pretext whatsoever, exclude any section of workers. 2. That workers' candidates are nominated everywhere in opposition to bourgeois democratic candidates. As far as possible, they should be League members, and their election should be pursued by all possible means. Even where there is no prospect of achieving their election, the workers must put up their own candidates to preserve their independence, to gauge their own strength, and to bring their revolutionary position and party standpoint to public attention. They must not be led astray by the empty phrases of the Democrats, who will maintain that the workers' candidates will split the Democratic Party and offer the forces of reaction the chance of victory. I'm going to read that again because how many times have you heard this before? They must not be led astray by the empty phrases of the Democrats, who will maintain that the workers' candidates will split the Democratic Party and offer the forces of reaction the chance of victory. What is the priority? Preserving independence, gauging our own strength, and bringing our revolutionary position and party standpoint to public attention. Continuing. All such talk means, in the final analysis, that the proletariat is to be swindled. So again, when you buy into, you're a spoiler and you're going to hand it to the Republicans, that means that you are being swindled, per Marx and Engels. The progress which the Proletarian Party will make by operating independently in this way is infinitely more important than the disadvantages resulting from the presence of a few reactionaries in the representative body. If the forces of democracy take decisive, terroristic action against the reaction from the very beginning, something sorely lacking today, the reactionary influence in the election will already have been destroyed. The first point over which the bourgeois Democrats will come into conflict with the workers will be the abolition of feudalism, as in the First French Revolution. The petty bourgeoisie will want to give the feudal lands to the peasants as free property. That is, they will try to perpetuate the existence of the rural proletariat, and to form a petty bourgeois peasant class, which will be subject to the same cycle of impoverishment and debt which still afflicts the French peasant. The workers must oppose this plan, both in the interest of the rural proletariat and in their own interest. They must demand that the confiscated feudal property remain state property and be used for workers' colonies, cultivated collectively by the rural proletariat with all the advantages of large-scale farming, and where the principle of common property will immediately achieve a sound basis in the midst of the shaky system of bourgeois property relations. Just as the Democrats ally themselves with the peasants, the workers must ally themselves with the rural proletariat. The Democrats will either work directly towards a federated republic, or at least, if they cannot avoid the one and indivisible republic, they will attempt to paralyze the central government by granting the municipalities and provinces the greatest possible autonomy and independence. In opposition to this plan, the workers must not only strive for one and indivisible German republic, but also within this republic for the most decisive centralization of power in the hands of the state authority. They should not let themselves be led astray by empty democratic talk about the freedom of the municipalities, self-government, etc. In a country like Germany, where so many remnants of the Middle Ages are still to be abolished, where so much local and provincial obstinacy has to be broken down, it cannot under any circumstances be tolerated that each village, each town, and each province may put up new obstacles in the way of revolutionary activity, which can only be developed with full efficiency from a central point. A renewal of the present situation, in which the Germans have to wage a separate struggle in each town and province for the same degree of progress, can also not be tolerated. Least of all can a so-called free system of local government be allowed to perpetuate a form of property which is more backward than modern private property, and which is everywhere and inevitably being transformed into private property, namely communal property, with its consequent disputes between poor and rich communities. Nor can this so-called free system of local government be allowed to perpetuate, side by side with the state civil law, the existence of communal civil law, with its sharp practices directed against the workers. As in France in 1793, it is the task of the genuinely revolutionary party in Germany to carry through the strictest centralization. This is followed by a note by Engels to the 1885 edition, beginning here. It must be recalled today that this passage is based on a misunderstanding. At that time, thanks to the Bonapartist and liberal falsifiers of history, it was considered as established that the French centralized machine of administration had been introduced by the Great Revolution, and in particular that it had been used by the Convention as an indispensable and decisive weapon for defeating the Royalist and Federalist reaction and the external enemy. It is now, by 1885, however, a well-known fact that throughout the Revolution up to the 18th Brumaire, the whole administration of the département, arrondissement, and commune consisted of authorities elected by the respective constituents themselves, and that these authorities acted with complete freedom within the general state laws, that precisely this provincial and local self-government, similar to the American, became the most powerful lever of the Revolution, and indeed to such an extent that Napoleon, immediately after his coup d'etat of the 18th Brumaire, hastened to replace it by the still existing administration by prefects, which, therefore, was a pure instrument of reaction from the beginning. But no more than local and provincial self-government is in contradiction to political, national centralization. Is it necessarily bound up with that narrow-minded cantonal or communal self-seeking which strikes us as so repulsive in Switzerland, and which all the South German federal republicans wanted to make the rule in Germany in 1848. End of Engels' note. We have seen how the next upsurge will bring the Democrats to power and how they will be forced to propose more or less socialistic measures. It will be asked what measures the workers are to propose in reply. So what demands do the workers make? At the beginning, of course, the workers cannot propose any directly communist measures. But the following courses of action are possible. 1. The workers can force the Democrats to make inroads into as many areas of the existing social order as possible, so as to disturb its regular functioning, and so that the petty bourgeois Democrats compromise themselves. Furthermore, the workers can force the concentration of as many productive forces as possible, means of transport, factories, railways, etc., into the hands of the state. 2. The workers must drive the proposals of the Democrat to their logical extreme. The Democrats will, in any case, act in a reformist and not in a revolutionary manner, and transform these proposals into direct attacks on private property. If, for instance, the petty bourgeoisie propose the purchase of the railways and factories, the workers must demand that these railways and factories simply be confiscated by the state without compensation, as the property of reactionaries. If the Democrats propose a proportional tax, then the workers must demand a progressive tax. If the Democrats themselves propose a moderate progressive tax, then the workers must insist on a tax whose rates rise so steeply that big capital is ruined by it. If the Democrats demand the regulation of the state debt, then the workers must demand national bankruptcy. The demands of the workers will thus have to be adjusted according to the measures and concessions of the Democrats. So comment, push, 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 drive them to their extreme. That is the objective there. Whatever they propose, you go further. Although the German workers cannot come to power and achieve the realization of their class interests without passing through a protracted revolutionary development, this time they can at least be certain that the first act of the approaching revolutionary drama will coincide with the direct victory of their own class in France, and will thereby be accelerated. But they themselves must contribute most to their final victory by informing themselves of their own class interests, by taking up their independent political position as soon as possible, by not allowing themselves to be misled by the hypocritical phrases of the democratic petty bourgeoisie into doubting for 1 minute the necessity of an independently organized party of the proletariat. Their battle cry must be the permanent revolution. That's the end of the audiobook. So, as far as this having been a text or treatise regarding gun control and gun rights, hardly. It is mentioned, but in passing. What this address by Marx and Engels to the Communist League, basically the Communist Party of the day, fundamentally is about is, hey, there is an upcoming revolution, not a workers' revolution, but a revolution where the big bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie are going to be much bigger players than the workers. In fact, Marx and Engels basically considered it a foregone conclusion that the bourgeoisie was going to set up a new government at this point. And basically what this is about, fundamentally, is how do workers take the biggest step forward that they possibly can manage during this time of acute change and upheaval. And then, once the acute change and upheaval is done, how do they set themselves up to be as fortified as they possibly can against workers being co-opted by the new bourgeois government? How do workers retain their political independence and class consciousness as an organized and armed force? If we look at the United States today, that battle is lost. In fact, it was lost long ago, at least in regard to the last window of opportunity of acute uprising and change that was available to the working class. These types of instructions given by Marx and Engels, and then later developed by Lenin and others, were not followed. That is, they were followed by some, but not on the mass scale required to retain that political independence. Many errors of opportunism were made, and we're currently languishing through a period of neoliberalism, extreme reaction, as a consequence. So, I do believe that another window is coming up where acute change and turmoil may be happening. We need to take much better advantage of it this time. I recently posted on the YouTube channel's community tab that U.S. workers haven't launched a socialist revolution, not for lack of guns or muskets, rifles, and cannons, as Marx said, but for a lack of class consciousness and workers' independent political organization. That is why workers in countries like the United States have not abolished capitalism. I do think that currently there is an increase in class consciousness driven by poor conditions and also driven by increased information available through the internet. This increased class consciousness has driven more workers to seek political solutions, more fitting political ideologies that can actually suit their interests as working class people. And then consequently, we are seeing the beginning of some of the workers' organizations being rebuilt. This process is going to continue in the coming years, and we have to encourage it along as much as we possibly can. Without those key elements, which are the majority focus in this document, no constructive action can be taken. With that, I'm going to sign out. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. In the meantime, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. We don't run ads on this channel, so that patron support is vital and much appreciated. Every contribution is encouraging. It's also materially helpful, and it has helped me to spend a lot more time producing content for this channel than I would have been able to do without that support. So very much appreciated. Thank you, patrons. Beyond that, video engagement is also key, so like, share, subscribe, comment on, even if it's just thanks or good video, and otherwise try to spread the videos. The channel has been growing steadily, which is great. I really thank everybody for their engagement with it in this way. We're trying to make this material as accessible as possible so that it's as easy as possible for workers who are starting to develop that class consciousness and ask critical questions about society and capitalism to stumble across it and get on the right track as quickly as possible. Thanks again, and we will catch you in the next video.